Welcome to Scary Stories, the channel that tells you scary stories.
Welcome to Scary Stories NYC. Smell the coffee? It's Sunday morning. Time for Scary Stories? Why not? After all, this first one is called Sunday Morning Dogman, as told to Peter Bernard. Dear Scary Stories, this is a story that happened when I was a kid in the early 1970s. My parents went through a rough patch for a while and left us with our Aunt Ida, who was very strict compared to what we were used to. She also used to preach a lot at us and make us go to church, but she never came along with us, and we saw that as kind of hypocritical. Our parents weren't religious, so we were very unaccustomed to church and the culture surrounding it. I don't remember ever being up early on a Sunday before we went to stay with Aunt Ida. So one Sunday soon after, my sister and I decided that instead of walking to church as we had been instructed to, we would wander off into the forest, which I remember was covered in just a couple inches of snow. We had a lot of fun. Then my sister noticed the time on her Minnie Mouse watch, and we realized we had better start heading back to Aunt Ida with some story or another about what we had learned in church. My sister had a small Bible with her, and she started flipping through, looking for an interesting story we could say we heard the preacher tell us. I remember she was walking along kind of how people do now with their telephones, just staring at what they're reading, not watching where they're going. She walked right into a big tree branch before I could warn her. Then she was down on the ground, crying and holding her head. I tried to comfort her, but there's really nothing you can do in that situation except wait for the pain to subside a bit, then get back to walking home. She was crying that she didn't know what to tell Aunt Ida about how she got all covered in snow. What would she say if she got a bruise on her forehead? My sister was acting like the worst thing in the world had just happened. And then, the worst thing in the world happened. Something large pushed its way through some trees and landed hard on the ground near us. It let out a snort so loud I thought there was a horse standing there. But when I looked, I didn't see a horse. Oh, it was as tall as a horse, probably taller, but it was reared up on its hind legs, and its front legs looked almost more like a man's arms. The chest resembled that of a man as well. The thing is, it couldn't have been a man, because it had the head of a dog. A snarling, angry dog. I remember it was dark, and it was covered in fur. It was not a mangy bear, because the fur was even all over. We ran the rest of the way back to Aunt Ida's, and I saw it trotting after us several times. Each time I glimpsed the monster, it was always on its hind legs. Although it chased us more than half the way, it never overtook us, which I'm sure it could have done. I guess we were lucky it came across us when it wasn't hungry. We cried to Aunt Ida that we had seen a wolf man and it chased us. She asked us why we were in the woods, and we were too upset to lie. So we told her we had skipped out on church. Aunt Ida told us that wasn't the wolf man we saw. It was the devil, and we were lucky he let us off this time with only a warning. Needless to say, we were up early for church the next Sunday, but we didn't walk near that woods ever again after that. Aunt Ida had one of the neighbors drive us to church with their family. And so we never ever again saw the Sunday morning Dogman. Sunday Go to Meeting Dogman, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. Every Mother's Day, I think back on a particular Mother's Day of my youth. It was unremarkable in most ways, and I only remember it because of something that took place in just a few minutes. But those few moments completely changed my life, because that was the day that I came face to snout with what I called a monster, but what I think you all now call Dogman. It was last May when I was telling this story to my niece, and she didn't seem surprised at all when I described the monster. She said, "Oh, you saw Dogman, that's cool." And then she changed the subject and talked about Mr. Slender or something, or Mr. Splendor, the Splendor Man, I think. But her comments sent me to my phone's search engine, entering Dogman and finding all sorts of interesting tidbits. The work of Linda Godfrey particularly interested me because my sighting occurred not all that very far from the center point of her first book about the Dogman, Bray Road. There's an area in Price Park Conservancy north of Bray Road with picnic tables, and so after church on Mother's Day we all went there every year for family picnic lunch. Why my parents would bring me to an outdoor area in my Sunday finest, then stress the entire time about me not getting dirty, I'll never understand. Nevertheless, this is what would happen every Mother's Day. This one year, I was starting to grow up, and I recognized a girl from another family, then went over to talk to her. She was a really special girl, not like the others. I don't mean that in a dreamy, romantic way. I just mean she was a very spiritual person, and I found myself drawn to her. Let's call her Angelina because she was very angelic. Her parents, unlike mine, encouraged her to go out and meet the world. They suggested the two of us go for a walk and have a talk. We liked the idea and we walked away hand in hand. My parents shouted after me not to get my clothes dirty, but I pretended I didn't hear them to play it off cool in front of the girl. I'm half joking about that. I didn't think of Angelina as a potential girlfriend. I thought of her as a sort of a light source. In actuality, I probably didn't think about her at all. I just sensed her and responded with instinct. She would be really quiet, but when she spoke, it was always something that I'd have to think about for a really long time. Like on that particular Sunday, I was saying that when it's sunny and warm, but not too warm, it feels like everything in the world is good. She said, "Everything in the world is always good all the time. It's just that it's only rarely very pleasant." I asked her how something unpleasant could be good, and she said good isn't subjective, while pleasant is very subjective. So, in other words, I thought out loud, everything is always good, it's just not always good for me personally, is that it? "It's always good even for you," she corrected me. "It's just that it's rarely very pleasant." I'm paraphrasing from memory, but those were the kinds of conversations we would have every time I ran into her. When I was younger, I tried to be a writer, and every story I wrote was about her and her weird ideas and semantics. I was fascinated with her for years, but like I keep saying, I never thought of her as a girlfriend. So she turned around and started walking back to camp, and I asked why. She said something about how it might turn very unpleasant very quickly if we went any further into the woods. That completely intrigued me, and I wanted her to explain further. Was there a mountain lion down the path? A coyote? A bear? She gave me the weirdest look, and she sighed heavily. Then she took my hand, and we started walking further down the path. "I thought you said it would get unpleasant down this path," I asked her. She said, "No, I told you it would get very unpleasant down this path." Then she looked at me and smiled, adding that she could tell I wanted to go anyway. She was convinced it would be unpleasant, but she had no fear of the unpleasant. She was not a normal person, you know? So we actually talked about trivial things at that point. I was asking what kind of berries were on this bush when we heard a low, deep, guttural growling. I thought it was a tiger or some other kind of big cat. I looked around in the bushes and at branches over our head. I heard sometimes they'll jump down on you. Still, I saw nothing and the growling continued. Now I was smelling something that reminded me of the time I didn't take the garbage out all weekend, that time when my parents left me home alone. I looked left, right, up, and behind me. Angelina remained calm, and after a few moments of my own panic, I noticed she was looking at the bush directly in front of us, which was moving. It felt to me like the entire world stopped spinning and the inside of my head started as I watched this hairy, ugly thing rise up from behind the bush. It was taller than me and kind of gangly with long arms and legs. It was covered in a gray to black coat of fur or thick hair, most of which seemed either wet or greasy or something. It stood on its hind legs, but it did not look like a man. It looked like a huge dog. I don't know how it balanced on its hind legs, but it did. It looked like a dog doing a stupid pet trick, except it wasn't wobbly, it was very sure on its feet. The front paws were held together in front like it was begging. It did not have hands like I sometimes hear on your channel. It had very big paws with big claws, but they were not hands. Its head was a dog head with ears on top. I don't remember details about the ears or the eyes because this thing was snarling and showing off its huge fangs. Once my eyes went up that body to that large, slobbering, angry-looking predator mouth, I only saw anything else in the periphery. I was imagining how many bites it would take that thing to get to the chocolatey center of me when it screamed. This terrified me, and I took a few steps away from it, turning to see the thing was running away from us and was in the trees and gone in less than a second. I could see its back for a split second, and its hair was nasty looking. Whatever that thing was, it looked massively, insanely strong, and yet it didn't seem very healthy. We could hear it running for a while, but we never saw it again. After a moment of stunned silence, I heard laughing. Eventually, I realized it was Angelina. She was laughing at how shocked I looked. "Life always surprises you," she said. "That's your saving grace and your Achilles heel." Don't ask me what that meant, because I never figured it out. We walked out of the forest quickly, and then strolled slowly the rest of the way back to our families. I was kind of annoyed at her by that point. Why wasn't she shaken up by that monster we just almost got eaten by? And how had she known it was going to be there? What was the deal with that girl? In fairness, she never specifically said there would be a dog-headed monster there. She just said it would be something unpleasant. Angelina went on to become a nun, or at least the last I heard, she had entered seminary school or whatever it's called, so she was training to be a nun. I hadn't even known she was Catholic, but I guess I wasn't that surprised when I got the news. I think she and I talked about the monster once or twice after that, but we lost touch as I've already indicated, and I wouldn't know how to look her up any longer. I'm left with a lot of questions about what we actually saw. Clearly it was some kind of dog. Did it walk on its hind legs normally? Or is it possible that one or both of its front legs were injured, and it had no choice but to run around in an upright fashion? It did not look unbalanced or unnatural, though. It looked as though this was how it was born to move. The front paws seemed normal, as I've said, but I wasn't really studying them at the time. I suppose it's possible they might have been injured or weakened by disease and I might not have noticed. After all, the entire incident happened in less than 30 seconds, probably less than 20. Was this a sick or injured wolf or large dog with mange? I didn't get a clear look at the ears, which might have helped narrow down the species. I do think I remember them standing up, but I don't know if I remember them being pointed or being rounded, if the edges flopped over or stood up or what. I can tell you that the teeth were fangs, and they seemed unnaturally long and sharp. I suppose that could be because of gum disease, which would pull the gums back, exposing more of the teeth and therefore making them appear longer. On the other hand, this possibly might have been a new species altogether, one unknown to science. It did not seem to me like a man with a wolf head exactly, but more of a wolf that walked, if that makes sense. I learned a big lesson that day, though. I learned that if you are warned something will be unpleasant, walk in the opposite direction. That's the advice I live by to this day, and maybe that's why I've never seen a Dogman again. Stay tuned, we got more Dogman stories coming up right after this.
Do you have a scary story you want us to read on the show? Just call our voicemail hotline, 804-LIST-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. And now for something completely scary.
Ferocious Dogman versus Ravenous Sasquatch. As told to and read by Peter Bernard. Nobody believes the story I'm about to tell you, most of all me. These are the ravings of a lunatic and a madman, yet what I'm about to tell you is exactly how I remember things happening the day I saw two supposedly mythical predators battle ferociously right in front of my very eyes. This is a story from the 1970s when I took a few years off after college to quote-unquote find myself. It's what all the in kids were doing back then. Only I took it very seriously and I went searching in more far-off places than most people would. As we say now in the 21st century, I went completely off the grid and I stayed there for almost a year and a half. When I returned to civilization, I had a beard that all my friends made fun of me for. There was a TV show back then called Grizzly Adams, and that became my new nickname. I did get to see a grizzly bear one time, and fortunately it was pretty far off. I once had a real fight with a hungry bobcat, and I got torn up pretty bad, but it came out alive. I just missed getting bitten by a rattlesnake, and I kicked it in the head by accident as I freaked out in reaction. To be honest, I'm lucky I made it out alive there too. There was a time when I was hiding in the Bankhead National Forest in northern Alabama. Living there. It's around an hour and a half north of Tuscaloosa and I guess about 2.5 hours south of Nashville. I'll tell you what though, it can be hard to tell the boundaries of that forest since most of the area that people live in around it is still pretty forested. I kept moving to a new place to camp each night and foraged for food during my days. I never got any hassle from the rangers who I would wave to when they passed by. Technically, I wasn't really living there, I was just living, and I happened to be there while I was doing it. I don't see how that could possibly be wrong in anyone's eyes. So let's jump to the big scene. I was camped out and sleeping when something woke me up. I caught the tail end of a scream that sounded like it was right outside my tent. I want to say a woman's scream, to be honest, I just know it was the scream of someone or something. Sometimes big cats can sound almost human when they cry in the night, and I wondered if one of them had wandered into my camp. If so, he must be hungry or else deranged and sick. All at once I was shaking all over. I remember the feeling of absolute fear gripping me. That scream had been loud. It was like deep sleep one second, awake and shaking all over the next. I wanted to poke my head outside the tent, but I was too chicken and opted to sitting as still as I could manage instead. I remember listening as intently as I ever had and wondering what would come next. All my attention was to the left of the tent where I had heard the scream. I heard nothing at all now, but I knew something was about to go down. From behind me, with zero warning, came a roar. That was different from the scream. This was not the same thing that had screamed to my left. This was something else that had roared to my right. I wondered what could be going on since both of those sounded like the cries of a predator, not prey. Was I sleeping in the middle of a turf war? Was I about to be drawn into it? Now I was listening to all directions around me, not knowing what was happening. In front of me was the tent flap, so inviting. I wanted to go outside and see what was happening so badly, but I had no weapons with me other than a Swiss Army knife, of which I think I had the corkscrew drawn to use for defense if necessary. I am not ashamed to admit that I got on my knees and in my head I silently prayed. I apologized for all my sins and asked for permission to make amends with anyone I had wronged. I prayed for this little battle outside to move elsewhere. Weeping as quietly as I could, I sat with my back against the tent. Never had I felt so powerless before. It was all entirely out of my control. I had to just pray that I wasn't going to get hurt tonight. And then Something poked me in my back through the tent, and I screamed and went flying through the tent flap and running across the field, almost tripping and falling down the side of the steep hill. I found a tree and hid behind it, peeking out. That was the first time in my life that I ever saw a Sasquatch. And the last time too, at least so far. So yeah, anyone can see a Sasquatch peeking out at him from behind the tree. But it takes someone like me to be peeking out from behind a tree at a Sasquatch. There he was. A giant, hairy man, just like they say. I don't remember much in the way of details, as I was in absolute horror and convinced that I was about to die. Also, this was a long time ago. Anyway, it looked like a man in the face, a primitive man. It didn't look like an ape, except its fur was very much like an ape's fur. I never thought it was a gorilla or a chimp. It was too tall and it stood almost as straight as a human. It was definitely something we would call Bigfoot. He was carrying my bag of food with him. I used to tie my food up in a plastic bag and hang it up from a tree higher than any of the local animals should be able to reach. I wanted to keep my food out of camp in order to prevent bears from wandering in and eating all of it. Anyway, this Bigfoot had taken all my food down and was eating it like popcorn. I had various kinds of nuts and berries that grew locally and a big bag of sunflower seeds that I had bought a long time ago. He was making an absolute mess of everything and eating my entire stash while he seemed to be looking around for something. I was pretty sure I knew what it was. I had been cooking a fish that I caught earlier and it probably smelled for miles. I had finished it though, and all that was left were some bones. He finished all the berries and whatever he found edible in my bag, then focused on searching even harder for the location of the fish. That's when I heard that roar again from behind me. I dropped to the ground immediately. I couldn't believe the Sasquatch wasn't the one who had made that roar. I was looking directly at him and then heard the roar behind me. I held as still as I could, and from my position behind the tree, I really couldn't see anything at all. Then, incredibly loud, I heard the scream again. That was the sound the Sasquatch made. It was deafening, and my heart was beating like a tiny bird's heart. I felt like I was going to die even if none of these impossible things ever touched me. The fright of the situation was impossible to endure. It was excruciating. I wanted to run but knew I was better off just making myself as small as possible and waiting for this situation to play itself out. And that's what it did all right, as this freaking Tyrannosaurus of a marsupial dog monster animal came smashing out of the forest to my left, and I literally held onto the tree in front of me. This thing shook the ground so much when it moved. I could hear these two monstrosities screaming at each other like kaiju, and I figured the battle was over my fish. Why didn't they just catch their own? They had to know where the water sources were around there. The food was not that scarce, after all I had been living off it. Suddenly I felt a bit guilty. Had my diet impeded on theirs? In my defense, neither of these things were supposed to even exist, so how could I know? I peeked out from behind the tree and witnessed the most vicious fight I hope to ever see. It was 10 times that modern UFC kind of fighting. These animals were not bluffing, and they were not just looking to get the other to back down. For some reason, my camp had become ground zero in a turf battle between two very desperate and humorless-looking beasts. The Bigfoot was taller, but the dog-headed roaring beast walked bent over with his tail held out behind him. To me, that was probably a marsupial that just looked like a dog. It was sort of like a running kangaroo with a larger head and huge saber-like fangs. It had claws, but its arms were very short compared to the Bigfoot. I guess that's why it made me think of a tyrannosaur. I'm trying to imagine it in my mind, and I think it had arms as long as a human's proportionally, but don't hold me to that. Definitely the Bigfoot had the advantage in terms of reach, but he didn't seem to use it. The Dogman was lunging at the Sasquatch's throat, going straight for the kill from the word go. He would get a hold of the Bigfoot's arm and just snap at it. The Bigfoot fought back in much the same way when I thought he really should have been using his massive arms. The Dogman had all the momentum and the two rolled around on the ground, stirring up dust and screaming a lot. The Bigfoot seemed genuinely surprised at the ferocity of the upright walking canine, and he soon beat it off into the forest. The Dogman chased him, made sure he was gone, then went to work making an absolute mess of my camp. Dogman tore nearly every one of my earthly belongings to absolute shreds, and I couldn't do anything but watch him do it. The needless destruction really annoyed me. It seemed unnatural and a waste. They say only humans destroy for no reason, but that night I saw some utterly pointless destruction carried out by that werewolf or whatever it was. But I consider myself lucky to be annoyed or to feel anything at all, since that was a very close call. I had to go stay with my parents and get back on my feet enough to go back in the wild, but I did do another 5 or 6 months off the grid after that. So I guess I can't say that either Bigfoot or Dogman scared me off of camping. I just never camped in that forest again. Don't go away, we have another Dogman story right after this. In the description of this video, we've got a link to our new Scary Stories t-shirt. It's our classic skull logo and it says Scary Stories underneath in the Kaiju Monster font. It comes in black and also black and other dark colors such as black. Good for ladies or gentlemen, hoodies too, whatever you need. Dogman capsized my kayak, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. I've told this story to a few friends and I got laughed at once, ridiculed the second time, and the third time I was told that I hadn't seen a Dogman, I had seen a Sasquatch. At that point, I gave up trying to tell friends about what happened at all. I was going to remain silent forever, but I figured nothing would be lost by me adding an anonymous version of the events to your show. Okay, I was out kayaking in the Everglades with some friends while on spring break back when I was just 21 years old. My friends were also about the same age, and their names were Rocco, Jelka, his girlfriend, and Karina, who was my girlfriend. Rocco and Jelka were Croatian, and I forget why they were in America, like a student exchange or something, but we were really only friends for that 1 year while they were here. Now we keep in touch on Minds a bit, but I haven't asked them in person to tell this story, so the less said about them, the better. I'm not trying to expose them to ridicule, just to tell my story. So, we were kayaking through the Everglades without a guide, which is not something you should ever do. We were idiots, but that doesn't mean you have to be. The thing that happened to us was so weird that it probably might never ever happen to anyone else ever again, but we weren't even prepared for any of the well-known dangers down there either. And by not prepared, I mean both in terms of equipment or mentality. Okay, I have no idea exactly where we were, except that there were trees on either side and it was a long body of water. Sometimes the trees would come up super close to the boat and we could see the little lizards crawling all over them like cockroaches. Who knows how many snakes and other dangerous animals we were right up next to, but too lost in our own little world to even notice. Then again, we were so loud that we probably scared most everything away. I thought it was kind of cool how in some places the roots of the trees were all above ground. I guess they hadn't always been, but the water constantly flowing changes many things. We were having too much fun to notice that it was getting later. Karina told me she was seeing eye shine coming from inside the roots looking at us, and I thought she was joking. It sounded like she was doing her fake scared voice, but it turned out that sounded the same as her real scared voice, and she started getting me a little scared too. I figured they were alligators or snakes or that kind of thing. We decided to make a turn off, thinking it would lead us back towards civilization. We were more than a little wrong about that. So the night started coming on and we were kayaking with no compasses or maps or idea where we were heading. It was already getting hard to see in front of us. Rocco suggested we get out and camp, and the other three of us shouted to him that he was a moron. We kept rowing, growing pretty tired. I know I felt like my arms were going to fall off, and I was in the best shape of the four of us. We were exhausted and decided to try to nap there on the water. I know that was not a good idea. We were supposed to take turns sleeping. I don't know, when you're really tired, your ability to reason becomes fractured. So, I don't know what happened exactly, but the next thing is I'm waking up because I've been hit from below by something. I screamed and was very disoriented waking up. It looked like everyone else was waking up too, but it was so dark I might have imagined that. I had my flashlight out in a second, shining it around in the water and not seeing what bumped me. I told everyone what happened and asked if alligators did that. Nobody knew. Somebody said I had just imagined it in a dream, and then in the middle of a very loud splashing sound, a dog rose up out of the water and started climbing on top of my kayak. We all screamed and I started to beat it back with my oar and then with my fists. The thing turned me over and I was entirely submerged, then back up in the air again. I could see absolutely nothing under the water and could barely make any more out in the night air. Rocco came close enough to hit the water wolf hard a few times, and the thing simply dropped down into the water like a dead weight, disappearing completely. That did not happen. Dogs are not fish. Karina was becoming delirious. With another loud splashing sound, we saw the creature emerge from the water onto the shoreline. It was a dog, and it was huge. We could smell wet dog all over, and it was nasty. We watched as the dog shook himself off, water spraying everywhere, and then, to our great surprise, he stood up on his hind legs. We were now looking at the back of a 6 or 7 foot tall creature, covered in fur and dripping wet. I shone my flashlight on the animal and it turned around and squinted into the light, and then it screamed at us. I felt like it had just slapped me around and I cried as I started paddling out of there. That creature had scared me more than I had ever been scared in my life, and I paddled so hard, using reserves of strength far greater than I should have had. We all paddled, and we were truly panicked as the creature decided to follow along on the shoreline. We could see him some of the time. Then he would be out of sight behind trees, and we would wonder if the horror was over. Then we would hear him in the brush, and we'd start paddling faster and faster. One time he ran ahead of us and dove in the water. We had no idea what to do and stopped paddling. I think someone tried to paddle backward against the current. The dog just swam across in front of us to the other side, then continued along, trailing us on our journey. We soon saw why, as there was no passage on the right coming up for a while. Of course the Dogman would have known that before reaching the spot. This was a creature in his own habitat, and we were very far from ours. Rocco thought the creature was hurting us and said we should not follow it. I asked him where else we could go except down the river, since it wasn't like we had a helicopter. He started bickering and the two women started fighting as well, and then the Dogman roared. That shut us up. We paddled dutifully from then on, not speaking, trying not to even think. Morning came and Karina noticed we hadn't seen or heard the dog for a while. We eventually found a place to land near some buildings and wandered from there until we were suddenly in some town where we got ourselves breakfast. And that was that. We were just back to civilization like nothing had happened. And really it almost was like nothing had. We could have lost our lives, but we didn't, and so it might as well have been a dream. Who ever heard of a werewolf in the Everglades? And who ever heard of an aquatic dog that attacks boats from underneath? Even people who believe in Dogman aren't going to believe in a story like that. And yet, that is exactly what I remember happening the night I almost got drowned by Dogman.
Come back for more scary stories.